This morning we continue our study of deliverance in the book of Exodus. If you want to open your Bible and turn with me to Exodus chapter 17. If you don't have a Bible, there may be one located underneath the seat in front of you, or perhaps at the table in the back in the center where the bulletins are located. You can grab one from there if you want, or send someone to grab one for you. As we get situated this morning, we again pick up in Exodus chapter 17, and we're going to again dive right in this morning as we did last week, and we're going to pick up in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 17. Exodus 17, verse 1. And here we read, as Moses writes to us, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by the stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So if we remember Exodus chapter 16, where we were last week, and if you weren't here, we're going to give you a brief synopsis so don't feel left behind. It's the same story, just a different chapter. It's kind of like when your kids start asking for something, and then what happens in our house, and I don't know how you raised your kids, or perhaps how you are with your kids at home, when Ava Claire, if you know Ava Claire, she's our 3-year-old, she's very persistent. I mean, when you talk about persistent, she is, you might use the word headstrong, she is persistent. She is one I love dearly, but persistent is the word we use there. When she starts asking for something, it is almost constant. She goes, "Mom, Mom, Mom, Mom." And my response to Ava Claire is, "Ava Claire, you've used that word already. Think of something different." "Mom, I need some milk." "Dad, I need some milk." "Mom, can I do this?" And my response is always, "You've already said that. Think of something different. Come up with a different word. Come up with a different question. You can't keep using this. We've already answered that question. Come up with something different." Well, for her, she just changes the pronoun on the first half of the sentence, and she begins to ask again. And you think I'm exaggerating, but if you spend any time around her, like Bruce or her teachers over here in the Happy Hoppers, they know it's consistent. And the one thing you've got to get her the benefit of the doubt for, at least she's consistent. She's not changing her story. She's consistent. And so when we come into Exodus chapter 17 here, it's the same story, just a different chapter, and the object of what they're desiring here is just slightly changed. We're just reading an overview here. They would be led to believe here in this moment the people of God are still on their journey. Remember, they have fled Egypt. They have been freed from their slavery. They are not far removed, however, from the first time when God provided the manna and the doves for them, when God met their felt need of hunger, when God met their felt need of having something to quench their desire for food. And God literally rained down bread with a dip of honey, perhaps, if you want to start looking at the translation of it. And God met them with the delicacy of the moment, providing quail. I mean, quail in the Middle Eastern culture is the best of the best. I mean, it's the most prime ribeye you could have. It is the best of the best. So God meets their needs, but they are yet grumbling again here in this moment, and they are unsatisfied yet again. And it's almost as if the people of God do not have the ability to remember, to see and recognize the promises of God, even when they are right in front of them. Remember. They're on this journey in the wilderness, in a desert, and the way that they are going, they don't have GPS, they don't have a map, but the way that God is directing them is He is a cloud leading them by the day, and He is literally a pillar of fire directing them by night. Like, there's no street lamps, there's no flashlights, there's no cell phones they're using to illuminate things at night, but God literally Himself is a pillar of fire at night. And so here in this moment, they're asking the question, they're quarreling, saying, "Why did you bring us out here, out of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? I mean, they're having this short-term memory lapse here, thinking, you brought us out here and you're leaving us out here to die. And yet, if there's anybody in the history of the Bible who's had the constant, visible presence of God with them, it would be these people. In this moment, we can be reminded clearly of how God has shown himself to his people time and time again. He delivered them from their slavery when they were crying out. Remember, if we go back to the first 3 chapters of the book of Exodus, it points out that they were being heard by God. They were crying out from the oppression of the Pharaoh when he was putting more and more work on them and removing from them their comforts, but it was pressing down more work. He was removing the straw for the making of the bricks, and yet God hears them. God hears them, and God goes to Moses through the bush and says, you're going to go and you're going to deliver my people because I have heard their cries. And so God delivers them through signs and wonders. What the Egyptians saw as plagues and death is signs and wonders through the people of God. God delivers them when they were pressed on both sides by cliffs rising up on the sides of them, and from behind them, the Egyptian warriors were coming at them full speeds in chariots. God delivers them through the river. Literally, the river stands on end, and they walk through on dry land. God delivers them again, and they see the visible presence of God working on their behalf as they go through, as Moses leads them through the water, through on dry land. And then Moses goes back and he touches the river, and it floods down over the warriors, and they're completely wiped out. God delivers them through the sea. But God doesn't stop. We remember in Exodus 16 when the people grumbled, and perhaps the whole opening verses of Exodus chapter 16 is just a theme of grumbling and grumbling and grumbling. But yet God hears. He says, I hear their grumbling, and even in their grumbling, it displays a lack of faith, a lack of trust, and their desire to go back to Egypt where there was plenty to eat. And I use this emphatically because there wasn't plenty to eat in Egypt. They were not happy because they were crying out in the first few chapters of Exodus, but there was normalcy. They liked the normalcy more than they liked the provision of God. It didn't require for them to trust God in Egypt because there was normalcy. They were in the moment of Exodus chapter 16, they were preferring the oppression of Pharaoh over the provision and the trusting and the faithfulness of God. God doesn't allow them to return. God meets their need with a greater provision. He rains down bread from heaven. He brings them a delicacy of quail to meet their felt needs, and they are provided for. We discussed last week that the people of God are a people who are in need of deliverance, a people who are in need of salvation. And while perhaps there are different and more comfortable routes to take to get to the promised land, to get to Canaan, deliverance is not about comfort. Deliverance is not about comfort. It's about being delivered. It's about being reborn. This is the message of sanctification. You can get people out of slavery in an instant. This was the point we talked about last week. You can get people out of slavery in an instant. This is a huge point that Dr. Keller points out to us, but you can't get the slavery out of people except through a long process. You can get people out of slavery quickly, even immediately, but you can't get the slavery out of the people quickly. It takes a process. In these opening verses, the process of sanctification in Exodus 16 is still underway. The process of getting the slavery out of the people is still extremely evident. Here in the opening verses, the people of God are still grumbling, yet again complaining, and there was no water for them. However, things have become a bit more serious. Because notice here, we don't just see the word grumbling. The words most of our translations this time use is they quarreled with Moses. They quarreled with Moses, saying, give us something to drink. We are reminded ourselves so often when we are confronted with something, in this life, it often clouds our ability to see the full picture of what is going on around us. We often get lost in the forest for the trees. Quite often we need to step back, take a moment, and get a bird's eye view so that we can remember, so that we can have a proper perspective of how God is working. We must continually remind ourselves that our view of what is going on around us is limited of what God is working with, how God is leading us with a perspective that is divinely orchestrating from eternity past to eternity future. And when we get lost in this moment, when we get lost in the forest for looking at the trees, God is working something far greater. Because remember, we've talked about this since our study of Genesis last year. When we get lost in our moment, our view of the timeline is so limited to just this, and we get so caught up in this moment. Remember, we inherited this trait of grumbling. This isn't something that the millennials have. This isn't something that Gen Xers have. This isn't something that the baby boomers have. This is something that we inherited from the people of God from the time of the Exodus. We get caught of looking at this moment and grumbling and complaining about this moment because we're looking at this moment. And we forget that quite often God is working from eternity past way over that way to eternity future, to we're all gathered back up in the kingdom of heaven when everything is restored the way it's supposed to be. And we're stuck in this moment right here. We're right here. We're focusing on everything right here. And that's what the people of God, they're looking right here in this little bitty moment saying, where is the food? Where is the water? And they're so stuck on it that they've come so close right here in chapter 17 of saying, we're quarreling with Moses here. We're done. And what Moses and Aaron did in chapter 16 says, you don't have a beef with us. Your problem is not with us. Your problem was with God because we're nothing. We don't have any control of this situation. We're not orchestrating this. We didn't choose the route through the desert. We didn't choose this path, but God is directing us. Remember, the path of direction is coming through the cloud. The cloud of direction is coming through the fire. This is not us, but this is God, who is the director, who is the conductor of this symphony here. It's not the people, it's God. The people of God should follow God. And so when we're looking at this, we're missing it. We have to step back. We have to step back and recognize a God who is putting the pieces of the puzzle together with the box top of the puzzle in front of him saying, I've got this thing figured out. And it's for your good. And it's for my glory that this is working out. We recognize that God is giving them to us. He's given us this story in Exodus 16 and Exodus 17 to remind us that this is our story as well, that this is our story of sinfulness, but more importantly, this is the story of His sovereignty, and this is the story of His deliverance in our lives. For most of us, when we read this, our first thought is the grumbling has elevated to the point of louder complaining, perhaps. Maybe they're just speaking a little bit louder. It has risen to the point of perhaps some pushing and some shoving. Perhaps in this moment, Moses is joining in on the exaggeration. He's saying they're quarreling with me. They have a problem with me. And as he depicts the scene, surely we're not about to see road rage in the desert here. Right? You know what I'm saying? I mean, think about how frustrated you get with people. They got their phone out like this, they got their hand on the steering wheel, and they don't know how to drive. And you think quarreling, that's what we think of as quarreling. No, this is a much more dire situation here. The Hebrew word used here that is translated quarrel is a technical meaning to bring a charge. It is to frame formal charges. It is to institute legal proceedings, to summon someone before a bar of justice. So, in layman's terms here, the people have brought an indictment against Moses, saying, you have brought us out here to die. So they have brought an indictment of negligence and manslaughter against Moses, saying, you have brought us out here to die. You will stand against judgment for this. There is no lighthearted fight going on here. This is not a random bit of grumbling. This has become an overly serious matter. We don't need to lose sight of what is happening here. What we see and what Moses is writing to us and documenting in these words, and what God is teaching us here, is that this will affect all of human history, not just Exodus chapter 17 on this walk through the desert, but this is going to affect all of human history in this moment. Now stick with us. Stick with us here in this moment. The people of God The people that God has delivered from the Pharaoh, the people that God has displayed signs and wonders to deliver, the people whom God has brought out of death in Egypt, the people who God is feeding his happy meals to every day, are bringing charges against their leader, bringing an indictment for bringing them out into this desert land, for bringing them out to this dry and barren country to die. Do we have an accurate picture here? And you might think that this is not relatable to us at all, but it is. This is exactly what we do. We go about our daily lives and we fail to see. We fail to remember the provision of God daily. One of the things I love to place a high emphasis on is hearing the stories of God in our lives. Think about it. How often do you and I forget how God is providing for us daily? How God brought us from our place of darkness, revealed himself to us, brought us into a place of redemption, and has carried us through this life. When we think of testimonies, perhaps that's more of how you think of it. And to me, it's a story. I like to think of the word testimony more as a line of story. Why? Because there's a point in life, if we are a follower of Jesus, there's a point in life where God enters our life, where God brings us to a point of redemption. Because it doesn't matter if we grew up in church and we never were a drug dealer, we never were a prostitute, we never were all that kind of stuff, and hopefully most of us in this room, that's not our story. But there's a point, even if we were the whitest of the white, church-going kind of people, there was a point in our life where we were sinners, right? There's a point in our life where our life was not about following and loving Jesus. And there's a point where God enters that story. And there's a point where he enters that story and we start living life wanting to love and be in a relationship because God enters that storyline. And we recognize that, and we should know where that story is. Even if we don't know the exact moment, we know that there's a point in our life where conviction happens, where repentance happens, and we want to remember that because he does something, he divinely orchestrates something in our life where he is at work in us, and he brings us into his family. He orchestrates a work in our lives, and we start living for him. We start knowing him. He is working and bringing us into relationship with him, and then we start seeing how he is at work in our lives, and we start remembering things. And if we're younger, we don't remember things necessarily all the time, but then we start having points where we worship him and we remember the worship of him. And there's these moments that are highs and there's these moments that are lows. And moments that are lows are not moments to be forgotten, but moments that are to be remembered. Why? Because when we remember the moments that are lows, we can see God's provision to bring us out of them. Right? We don't want to forget the lows. Why? Because the lows remind us of how God is working to redeem even those. Because once we're redeemed, it doesn't mean we stop sinning. Right? Because what we learn throughout the whole Old Testament is sanctification is a process. It's a process of growing closer to God. And it's not that you're just here and you're done, but it's a process of being with him, getting closer, being right with God. It's a process that ends with us being with him in the new kingdom. And so we need to know that storyline. Who were you before God did a work in your life? Who have you been? What happened when God came into your life? Who have you been since God has been in your life? What does the storyline look like? And why do we need to remember these things? Because that we need to know. We need to be able to see. We need to be able to see the moments when God has been working in our lives. So that when we come into these things, these times, when we encounter the crisis of the next 5 minutes, and we say, well, God's not in our lives, we can look back and say, God is in our lives because God has brought us through this moment. God has brought us through this crisis when we lost our job. God has brought us through this crisis when we've had a marital problem. God has brought us through this crisis when we lost a family member. God has brought us through these times of sorrow and pain and suffering, and we can see these times of our story because what's really going on is it's not our story. It's his story of redemption in our lives. Because if we get caught up in the crisis of the next 5 minutes, there's always a next 5 minutes. There's always a next crisis. There's always something else. The car's always breaking down. If you live in my house, in the desert, there's always going to be another leak. You know what I'm saying? And if you've been at Booklift for the last year, you know I've had, 5 leaks, major leaks in a year? And I live in a desert. You're not supposed to have water raining down inside your house in a desert? But you know what I'm saying? And when you deal with crises like that, you're like, well, you can start questioning stupid things, but when you can start realizing that God has brought us to blank, blank, and blank, you have ammunition for perseverance. You have the ability to stick it out. This past week, I was driving home and I looked up. Literally, I go east on Patterson every day when I go home, or almost every day when I go home, depending on where I've been that day. And I was driving home early this week on Patterson, and the topic of the conversation almost any day of the week around here, if you're talking to anybody, is the lack of water in the valley. And this past week, I was driving home on Patterson, and I looked up, and the mesa had white on it. And if you've lived here long enough, the mesa having white on it in the wintertime is a significant deal. Because up until this week, the mesa was pretty much brown. And we've been talking about all winter long how dry it's been and how we've had no and will winter ever come, and any other topic of a conversation. And this week when I was driving home, I looked up and the thought that ran through my head when I was driving home was, God is still sovereign. Winter will be winter, and God knows how much water we're going to need. God put this all here thousands of years ago. God's got this thing figured out. Why am I worried about how white the mountain is? God is still sovereign. Things like that help us remember the providence and the plan and the sovereignty of God. Let us think about this for a moment. When we get caught up in whatever's happening in our life, we can look here in Exodus 17 and we can step back and quite often we judge the Israelites. We judge them in the book of Exodus. We can judge them in the book of Judges where they're continually being foolish. We can judge them when it comes to the life of Jesus and they nail Jesus and they say, why are y'all missing the picture here? And we say, how foolish are these people, how short-sighted. They cannot leave this whole slavery thing behind. But we can't either. We are slaves to our instantaneous wants, our desires, our superficial needs that we miss worship. Even sitting here this morning in worship, we feel our phones vibrate and we are worried about notifications and whatever else is going on in our life. What if we stopped multitasking enough that we were able to start worshiping with a singular focus? From what we learned in the desert, when we worship with a singular focus, everything else happens the way it's supposed to. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 7-8, about not being anxious. He talks about this in trusting the God who is providing. This is the message of the gospel. In Exodus 17, verse 4, Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go." I can almost feel this playing out. Moses is done. He's tired of the people. He realizes that this isn't just about grumbling anymore, but now we're to the point of an indictment, and this is not going to go well. This is going to be a whole other ordeal. So Moses cries out to God, "What am I going to do with them?" Point number 1 this morning. Moses cries out, "What am I going to do?" And we see here, God is a patient God. In this moment, God does not retort, "You were right, Moses, let's be done with them. This is a good place to let them die. It's as good a place as any." No, this is where we find the message of patience. This is where we find the definition of long suffering. Even when the people turn against you, when Jesus teaches us of perseverance in Matthew chapter 10, when brother turns against brother, we have a case study right here. Right here in Exodus 17. This is no hypothetical message that Jesus was teaching. In fact, the Old English word long-suffering gets us to the real biblical definition of God's patience, because God's patience does not just mean to be tolerant. He doesn't say, well, we're just going to have to put up with it. We're just going to have to endure it. Long-suffering means to take people who you disdain, people who you do not like to be around, people who you just want to get away with, or you just want to be not around anymore and you just want to reject. What God is teaching, what God is telling Moses here is you go, you serve them, and you meet their needs. God demonstrates patience here. God instructs Moses here in this moment to take the elders of Israel, to go and to get the staff. That's hugely important here. Watch this picture unfold here. The same staff that God had given Moses at the burning bush, the same one that had become the snake, the one that had been used to part the river, the one, and he says to take these men and to go to the place where God was going to show him. We need to see this context unfold. Get this picture, this scene in your mind. The people have a legitimately brought an indictment, or perhaps illegitimately brought an indictment against Moses, claiming that he was bringing them out here along with their livestock, and they were all going to die because of his leadership. Now Moses has gathered together a group of elders, and if you're watching this thing unfold here, you are seeing Moses gather a jury. This is a jury pool here. The elders represent the leaders of the nation of Israel. And so when you go to gather a jury, you're going to go to the leader. So he gathers a jury. Now Moses goes and gets the staff. Now the staff here is not just a stick, but that became a snake, or a stick that parted the sea, and a stick that brought down judgment on the people of Egypt. No, it's not just a stick. The stick represents judgment. The stick is the truth. When we think about the stick, we go into Egypt. God brought signs and wonders which represented judgment on the Egyptians in order to deliver his people from the hands of the Egyptians through the staff. When God told Moses to strike the Nile as it stood on its sides, allowing the passage, when God told Moses to strike it again, it fell down on all the warriors as they were trying to pass through, again to capture and conquer the people of God. It brought down judgment, and they are all washed away. Now in this moment, God tells Moses to gather the elders, to gather the leaders, the responsible ones, the jury to come, to get the staff, the stick of judgment, and to go to the place in which he tells them, this is not about fun. This is not about putting on a show. This is about freedom. This is about being free from slavery. And this is going to be about justice. And so we look here in 17 verse 6, and he says, God says this. Look, underline verse 6. He says, behold, I will stand before you. I will stand before you on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah. And because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord not among us or not? So verse 6. Hugely important verse here in this deliverance passage. We recognize the magnitude of all that is happening here. He says, behold, I will stand before you at the rock. The people have indicted Moses, but we have learned in Exodus 16, Moses says, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, in the morning the bread, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, and that you grumble against him, who were we? So the indictment is not against Moses. It's not against Moses in chapter 16. It's not against Moses in chapter 17. It's not against Aaron. And in this moment, their anger, their desperation, their moment of forgetfulness, their indictment of Moses is not an indictment of Moses. It's an indictment of God. It's an indictment of God. And here, in this moment, God has orchestrated for Moses to gather the jury, to bring the instrument of judgment, and to come to Horeb near Mount Sinai. Get that. This is all happening near Mount Sinai. Now, what happens at Mount Sinai? Mount Sinai is near where God talked to Moses at the burning bush. Mount Sinai is where Moses is going to receive the Ten Commandments. This is all near where the very same place where all this is going to happen. And we see, point number 2, God is present. So God is patient. God is present. Why? Because he says, I am going to appear before you. When we think of God being present with his people, perhaps we think of God often walking with Adam and Eve in the coolness of the day, or God speaking to Abraham, and God, Moses being at the burning bush, God passing by Moses at the top of the mountain, Jesus being present with the people in the New Testament. But here in this moment, we have a picture of a God who is present. And he's present for them when they're angry. He's present for them when they're complaining. He's present for them providing for his people in the midst of their need for liberation from their sins and their need of being liberated for their self-centeredness and their inability to see and remember the grace and the presence of God all around them. Here, God is present and present at their moment of judgment. We look at these words, and Moses doesn't waste words or use words carelessly. God says, I will stand before you at the rock. God is on trial. In this moment, the picture has shifted. The magnitude has grown infinitely about God. It's not about Moses here, but it's going to focus on the sovereign God. If you're a skeptic here in this moment, key in, because we often like to blame God for everything. Even if we're a believer in this room and we think about the next crisis happening, we say, well, if God is so great and God is so wonderful, then where is God? We like to blame God for everything. I mean, even the most astute believer goes through these moments of trials and pain and suffering, and sometimes we turn back. Instead of worshiping, we turn to blaming. And skeptics in this room this morning, and we know we're here this morning, we say, well, if God is so great, then why is there pain and suffering, and why is there evil, and why do we allow bad leaders to do bad things, and why is there death, and why is there natural disasters? And we look for a reason to put God on trial, and this is what happens here. The people of God, the people that God has delivered time and time again, have put God on trial. In a sermon called God on Trial, literally, Ed Clowney describes a play about a group of people who put God to the test. They wanted to know. Now, this is a play. They wanted to know who was responsible for the Holocaust, the destruction of millions of Jews and others in the Nazi concentration camps. Who was to blame? The play was called The Sign of Jonah, and it was written by Gutner Rutenbaum and was first performed in West Berlin shortly after World War II. The play not only asks the question of who's to blame, but it also draws both the cast and the audience into the answer. No one is really to blame. A stormtrooper merely followed orders. An industrialist merely kept up production. A citizen simply did not become involved. Yet in defending their own innocence, each of the accused becomes an accuser. All are guilty. Some are guilty by words, others by silence. Some of what they did, others by what they did not. And suddenly, the accused accusers all take up another cry. We are to blame. We are to blame. Yes, but we are not the most to blame. The real blame belongs to much higher. God is to blame. God must go on trial. God is to blame. God must go on trial. So that is what the people do. They put God on trial. In the play, God is accused, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced. And what is the sentence? The characters decide that God must become a human being, a wanderer on the earth, deprived of his rights, homeless, hungry, thirsty. He himself shall die and lose a son and suffer the agonies of fatherhood. And when at last he dies, he shall be disgraced and ridiculed. This is a play that was written at the end of World War II. Is this not the very thing that we do when our life does not go the way as we want it to, or the way that we believe it should as believers? As believers, when we think that our life is not going the way we think it should, we blame God. God is to blame. After all, God is sovereign. And in his sovereignty, he is the one who should be taking care of everything. If God is truly sovereign, then God is the one who has this thing under control. And if God is truly sovereign, he is the one who is at fault for all the evil in the world. So God is to blame. And as the skeptic unbeliever in the room, perhaps you ask the question, if God is so good, then how can there be so much evil and injustice? Absolutely, let's blame God. It's all his fault anyway. This is what the people of God did in Exodus 17. This is the message, deliverance that we find here. Jesus, as the redeemed, when life is not going our way, things do not seem to be the way that we want them to be, notice what happens here. God is drawing us closer to him. God is liberating us from our slavery, even in the midst of the wilderness wandering. God is liberating us, whatever our slavery may be. He is demonstrating his care and his love. There's nothing that happens in this life that happens to us that God is not allowing to happen, even when the tragedies happen. We must remember, we must not become short-sighted. We should meditate on the words of the writer of Hebrews when he writes in Hebrews chapter 6. He said, when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. God swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited to attain the promise. And continuing on, and he said, so when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have a strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that is set before us. We have this sure and steadfast anchor of this soul and the promise of God who cannot lie. A hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as the forerunner on our behalf. God is patient. God is present. Number 3, God is just. He tells Moses, notice this in Exodus, he says, behold, I will stand before you on the rock at Horeb, and you strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and people will drink. Moses strikes the rock. Moses brings judgment down on the rock, and out flows water, the provision of God. But it's not just about the water here in this moment. Let us not miss the message of salvation right here. Right here in this passage for us is judgment for an unbelieving people that points us to the salvation and the deliverance. Not just of the people of God wandering in the desert, but if you and I, who are wandering in our sin, needing deliverance, this is the message of salvation. The astounding thing about Exodus 17 is that God, in his mercy, goes beyond and gives us more than we have wrongfully asked for. When he says, you are to be blamed for my problems. You are to be blamed for my anger. You are to be blamed for my money problems, for my marriage problems, for the wars, for the evil in the world, for the disaster, and for everything else we can conjure up. Do we see that God goes so much further in displaying his mercy that we cannot fathom, because God does come down. God does come down, and he does take the blow of judgment. He stands in our place, and he takes our place at the trial for us. It wasn't just figurative, the staff striking the rock, and then all of a sudden water happens. The staff strikes the rock, and that is our water. The staff strikes the rock to symbolize what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. He knows what had happened. The day that Moses hit the rock was not just a day, it actually happened. Here's what happens in 1 Corinthians 10. And Paul writes this, he says, "For I do not want you." Write this down and go read it this week. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, "I do not want you to be unaware. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food, that is the manna, and all drank the same spiritual drink, that is the water that came from the rock. For they all drank from the rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." The rock was Christ. Nevertheless, look at verse 5. "Most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." Verse 6, Paul warns us. He says, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened." Why? Paul says these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction of on whom the end of ages has come. Exodus 17 is patently important to human history. Why? Because they serve as an example for us. Why? What do we know happens as they're on this journey? All of these things happen. They keep grumbling. They get eaten by snakes. They keep grumbling, and they fall into sexual immorality, and 23,000 of them die. They go in, and now it's time for them to enter the promised land, as we're going to get to later on in this journey. And what do? They send spies in, and they show again a lack of faith. And what happens? A whole generation of them die off. Exodus is extremely relevant to the Christian walk right now. Because it's a call to faithfulness, it's a call to trust, it's a call to obedience to us, to know God, to know a God who is consistent in Exodus 16, a God who is faithful in Exodus chapter 17, a God who is patient, a God who is present, and a God who is just, a God who is with his people, a God who is demonstrating an unending, unfathomable love for his people, and who is calling them to repentance, a God who is delivering his people from their slavery. This morning, let us be delivered from our slavery. Friends, on the cross, when Jesus was saying, when he said, "I thirst," do you know what was going on? Do you think that Moses just wanted God to just leave these ungrateful people right where they were finally in 39, not to do a thing for them? Don't they deserve just to leave them in their thirst? God didn't. Why? Because on the cross, Jesus took the judgment. So Jesus says in John 7, if anyone thirsts, John 7, Jesus says, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, streams of living water will flow within him. This is the only way. There is no other path. This is the way. There is no other way. God is just. This is the promise of Genesis chapter 3:15. There will be one who comes and crushes the head of the serpent. We see that happening on the cross. We find this is the greater priest that we read about in Hebrews chapter 6. So, this morning as we conclude, what objection is left? It was not right to ask for it, but if you are mad at God, the most you could ask for is that he would be punished. When we blame God for the crisis in the next few minutes or the next day or the next whatever it is, if we're mad at God, the only thing we could ask for is that God be punished. And you know what? It happened. It's done. We got what we asked for. He wasn't punished for his sins. He wasn't punished for this person or for that person. He was punished for you. He died of thirst so that you could drink. Remember on the cross? He said, I am thirsty. He died of thirst so that we would have what Jesus says in John 7, streams of running, never-ending water. Don't let the problem of evil and suffering keep us away from Him. Jesus says, come and drink. When we're in the wilderness, we like to put on this facade of anger and bitterness, and Jesus says, what's your problem? We're being delivered. We've been delivered. When we keep looking down, when we keep looking at the wilderness, when we keep looking at the desert, and we keep focusing on every little minute detail, we miss the redemption and the eternity that God is preparing all around us. Think about that this morning. Multitasking, multi-planning, stuffing as many things into this life is not the answer to fulfillment and to happiness. We don't need more distractions. We need to be focused. When we're in the wilderness, that's what we have to look at. If you look at that and you look at that and you look at that and you see what He's done and you see what He's done, we can worship. But if we're in the wilderness and all we keep looking at is the wilderness, then we miss the picture. And then we start complaining about being dry, and we keep complaining about the food not being so great, and we keep complaining about the leadership, and we keep complaining about everything else, and we miss the boat. God says, go to the rock and drink and never thirst again.